Chapter 17 Manifest Destiny Introduction. In this lecture, you will learn the sources of that irresistible spiritual and political force, kind of force of nature, which seemed to motivate Americans westward for 30 years, from right after the War of 1812, through James Monroe's fabled era of good feelings, through the progressive decades of Henry Clay's Great American System, through the emotional decades of the Second Great Awakening, through the visions of the euphoric utopians, through the contentious decades of the abolitionists and the slavery question, through all of that, as Americans streamed in unstoppable waves, in wagon trains, on horseback, and on foot, westward, ever westward, drawn towards the daily setting sun which attracted them like a magic magnet to the promise of the verdant valleys of Oregon's Willamette country, the mighty waters of the Columbia, which only Lewis and Clark had seen until the settlers saw it in all its wide power and stark grandeur, itself flowing ever westward, as they were, a clear, deep, welcoming river, which some of them rode like a bucking stallion to get further west, if they didn't drown in it first. And that was just the experience of the settlers headed west on the Oregon and other trails to the vast, mountain-fringed, lush farming land of the Pacific Northwest. Other wagon trains, thousands strong, forged across the inhospitable high Sierras that protected California like the Alps protected ancient Rome from Hannibal. A goodly number of these intrepid adventurers left their frozen remains in the thin air among the rocks, while others, only temporarily more lucky, left their bleached bones in the parched desert below, the last obstacle between their hopes and the fantastic reality of California. Just getting to California in those days earned you the right to be there, even if the negligent and indolent Mexicans still did legally own every inch of this coastal paradise. But the siren song of Manifest Destiny, so skillfully depicted in John Gast's painting in 1872, was singing to other acolytes as well, before Gast ever picked up a brush to show her likeness to Americans who already knew her like she was the girl next door. From Texas' Rio Grande to California's sun-drenched Pacific beaches, from the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains to the rain-blessed valleys of Seattle, John Gast's goddess of manifest destiny sang her song for decades with the disciplined conviction of a Greek prophecy, a decree from the gods themselves, which Sophocles would have recognized for its inexorability. She was the easiest lady to follow, and once you set out, there was no turning back. Whatever you found down the trail, and it was a long trail, no matter where you were going, was at the very least an adventure, and at most a whole new promised land. There were, of course, sometimes more than physical obstacles in the way. Other countries, chiefly the stuffy British and the impetuous Mexicans, owned, or pretended they owned, the piece of land that Lady Destiny called you to possess. But that was no problem, really. Americans had elected officials to negotiate such issues, and money and armies to settle the matter if it came to that. And settle them they did. People moved into the Oregon country of the Pacific Northwest, for instance, decades before the U.S. government got around to getting legal title to the area from the British. Settlers just assumed it would belong to them in time because they were Americans, and North America belonged to the Americans, no matter what the law said. The ambitious settlers of Texas moved there, regardless of what the Mexican government had to say about it, then declared independence and created their own country when the United States would not take them in as a new state of the Union. All of these hardy, risk-taking adventurers were singing that same song of manifest destiny, like a fight song at a football game. Come hell or high water, Americans intended to fill the North American continent from sea to shining sea, and from Canada to Mexico, even if it meant taking half of Mexico away from Mexico, which they did, and then expected the Mexicans to thank them for not taking the other half. In this lecture, you will learn how all of this was done. The point to gather here is the spirit of it all, how inevitable it seemed to be, how righteous and benevolent as well, we might add, for Americans thought of themselves as deliverers of the arts of civilization to the people they displaced. If they thought of such people at all, especially the Native Americans, whom Americans had been displacing already for 400 years. For those of you who enjoy historical irony, a case has been made that all of those displaced people got their revenge not long after the siren soprano of Manifest Destiny sang her finale performance on this continent, when the same Greek-like destiny which propelled millions of eager frontier settlers westward plunged them all into the hellish abyss of the American Civil War, which rent the country asunder, though only temporarily, with even greater force than had been summoned to stitch it together with Manifest Destiny in the first place. That said, you could still ask yourself if you would have been willing, in 1845, to uproot yourself from your low-paying factory job in some dirty eastern seaboard industrial city if somebody told you that there was a place for you in a wagon train headed for California or the Oregon country. You know what your answer would have been, and you know that your boss would have discovered the machine you were being paid a sustenance wage to tend was suddenly clanking away by itself, its human operator having ungratefully unshackled himself from the mechanical oar to which hunger had bound him, and traded his boring and hungry future for a new promise of prosperity. That was Manifest Destiny, and this lecture is the story of her siren song.